So we are back online again, and with a great pleasure, I want to introduce Dr. Steven Stack. He will be speaking today from Detroit in United States of America, where it's 9 a.m. in the morning. So he will be the most fresh participant of this conference by now. And Dr. Steven Stack has authored over 330 articles and chapters, as well as 4 books. That is really amazing, research that you have done and published. And I'm not surprised that American Association of Suicidology awarded you for lifetime contributions to suicide research in 2023. And Dr. Steven Stack's research interest includes social risk and protective factors of suicide, including economic strain, marital strain, dangerous media coverage, a very topic very hot in today's Lithuania, and other topics. So I don't want to spend more time on introducing, and let's hear your presentation. So the screen is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll load up my slides. Okay, well, thank you for the opportunity to present my work here today. It's very exciting. I'm basically, I am a sociologist, and so I approach suicide a little differently than in psychology. My talk is on the effectiveness of psychological versus macro income enhancing interventions. And so I'm dealing mainly with macro factors, which are not really the mainstream of suicidology. There's these 2 approaches to understanding and preventing suicide as I see it. There's the micro level, which gets most of the research, and I think it has made some really good contributions. But here, it's individual-centered. It defines suicide as an individual problem, like having, say, a bipolar disorder. And the solution is to treat individuals. And so you put people on various kinds of drugs, cognitive therapy, these sorts of things. You build up hotlines. You have gatekeepers trying to find suicidal people. But the approach that I'm used to as a sociologist is macro. It goes back to Durkheim, and it defines suicide as a social fact stemming from social and economic sources. And it requires, in the long run, structural changes in components of society, like the economy, family, mass media coverage, and these sorts of things. Both of these approaches have merit, but the latter one has been neglected in suicide studies. So I discuss how elements of social inequality, income inequality, and strength of the social safety net may help understand suicide in today's world, with a focus on, then I end up with a focus of income inequality and economic inequality more generally in the United States. Whoops. Okay, so I start with a problem, the puzzle of why suicide rates are increasing in the United States by 45% over the last 20 years. And in contrast, they're going down 24% over 20 years in Europe. So from a micro perspective, you might say, or raise the question, have mentally distressed persons increased by 45% in the US? This is, I think, unlikely. There's always been tens of millions of people over the last 20 years in the United States that are at risk of suicide. So there's a large supply of suicidal people, but only, there's like 50,000 deaths. There's over 11 million people that think about suicide, and then there's even more that are mentally troubled. At the macro level, though, social and economic structures designed to increase economic security may be less present in the United States than in Europe. Okay, these are the suicide rates in Western Europe and compared to the United States. And you can see in the United States in 2000, the suicide rate was about 10. And then about 20 years later, it went up to 14.5, or a substantial, about a 45% increase. In Austria, started out with 15.8 and it went down to 10.4. In Germany, the largest nation in Western Europe, the suicide rate was 11 in 2000, but it went down to 8.2 by 2019. So that the European mean suicide rate was 13 going down to 9.6, a 24% decrease compared to the 45% increase in the United States. And so the question becomes, well, why is that? I mean, this is like a really important issue for the United States in particular. This little research on this problem, in 2018, I published a conversation on the web that got more than 100,000 hits. And I suggested that a partial explanation for these divergent trends, suicide is up, up, up in the United States, suicide is down, down, down in Western Europe. There's substantial differences in income inequality. Income inequality is like the gap between the rich and the poor. And we think that as that increases, there's especially more stress at the bottom of society. And the bottom of society has a high suicide rate. And then there's also, secondly, there's differences in social welfare expenditures. In other words, like welfare payments and other sorts of transfer payments from the government can assuage or help the people at the bottom and like lift them up a little, and their suicide rate should be relatively low, we think. So that at the focus of my whole talk, you can set society up hypothetically in two ways. You can have relatively low income inequality, where there's not much of a gap between the top and the bottom, or society can be set up this way, where there's a large gap between the relatively poor and the relatively rich. Here we think that the poor have less stress. Their economic needs are met, whereas over here, the poor are going to have a lot of stress, and some of them will become suicidal. Okay, so here's the data on income inequality for European nations versus the United States. In the United States, the income inequality index was 0.415. This is a standard measure that's been used for about 50 years now. Whereas in Europe, the mean Gini index was 0.308. And so the amount of income inequality in the United States on average is about like 37% higher than it is in Europe. In Germany, you have an index of 0.317, Austria 0.302, Sweden 0.293, which is very low. It's low also in Belgium and Denmark and Finland, below 0.300. So the idea is that there's more economic stress at the bottom of society in the United States and in Europe. Okay, the other thing that I focused on was social welfare expenditures, or the size of the safety net. These things have to do with social welfare programs. The United States is at the low end of the countries in Western Europe and North America. In the United States, only 18% of the GDP is spent on programs to kind of uplift the poor through government expenditures, whereas in Europe, it's relatively higher. In Germany, 24%. The highest is in France at 31%. So there's a fairly substantial difference in what government does to uplift the people at the bottom. So the people at the bottom in the United States are relatively left behind, and you would expect there to be more suicide from a sociological standpoint. Okay, I'm going to swiftly change the context of what I'm talking about to just the United States, but there is some evidence by Tuttle and others that the greater the social welfare expenditures in those countries and others that Tuttle includes, the lower the suicide rate. So there is evidence that social welfare expenditures are associated with lower suicide rates cross-nationally. A third macro factor that distinguishes the United States from other countries like the ones in Western Europe is union strength, or the percentage of the persons in the labor force that belong to unions. Unions, especially those with strong ties to a labor party, as in the Scandinavian countries, can act as an effective voice for income redistribution and policies for social welfare expenditures. In the United States, only less than 10% of the labor force now belong to unions, compared to 33% in Europe. And so the idea in Europe, you have political power that can nudge governments to increase social welfare expenditures and reduce income inequality. Whereas in the United States, we have relatively weak union power. And here's the data on union strength. In the U.S., less than 10% of the labor force are in unions. The unions can push for less income inequality and more social welfare expenditures. In Europe, the average is 33%. Germany, the biggest country, 16%, but then in the Scandinavian countries, 58% of the labor force are in unions. In Sweden, 65%, but on average, you have a fairly substantial difference, a ratio of 3.4. The European union strength is over 3 times that on average than the United States. So I might explain the upward trend in suicide in the United States. Okay. I'm shifting now to looking at just the United States. The overall trend in the American suicide is upward, as we pointed out, increased 45% over 20 years. But some states may have been able to stem the tide against this rising problem of suicide. And so the present analysis now is going to shift to work on the impact of factors such as union density and social welfare expenditures, minimum wage laws in each of the 50 states over time. This is called a panel design, where you look at each one of the 50 states and you look at them usually over 20 or 30 years to see what factors may predict suicide trends in each of the 50 states. There's large differences in structures such as economic inequality and union density among the 50 states. And the following chart illustrates some of this variation. Here we have the 50 American states, and we have the percent of the poor in each one of the 50 states that gets temporary assistance to needy families. This is basically welfare money. And you can see that on the coast, Oregon and California, more than 40% of the poor households get welfare payments. Connecticut, where I'm from, well, Massachusetts, Vermont, and New Hampshire, over 40%. But then the deep south, the suicide rates are kind of high here. Some of the mountain states, they're high. The amount of poor families that get TANF payments is relatively low, like 0 to 10%. So you can see that there's like a lot of variation in the 50 states. I often look at the 50 states in the United States as like little countries in themselves, because they have a lot of leeway on how much they're going to follow federal transfer payment programs. Okay, so that the theoretical framework that I'm dealing with here has to do with strain theory, which comes out of economics, Hammermesh and Sauss, criminology, Agnew, some of my work. The key assumption is that lower status groups experience higher relative deprivation, and a gap between what they would like or what they expect financially and what they end up having. The lower socioeconomic status groups are marked. There's like 100 years of sociological research by all sorts of suicide risk factors. Although suicide is often not studied per se, rates of child abuse and neglect are higher in the lower socioeconomic classes. Family disruption, divorce is higher. Sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, disability rates, just about everything you can think of in terms of social problems is higher in the lower socioeconomic classes. Like you find intimate partner violence everywhere, but the idea is the rate or the incidence of intimate partner violence and child abuse is much higher at the bottom. Okay, so a meta-analysis of 1,200 and some effect sizes by Franklin and others found that lower socioeconomic status was one of the best 3 predictors of suicide, almost the same as suicide ideation and attempts. So like lower socioeconomic status, very important. And what I'm getting at is if you can lift up the people at the bottom, that might protect them from suicide. Okay, I think I'm starting to worry about time, so I think I'm going to skip ahead. Basically, what I'm doing here is a review of the literature, and there really isn't a whole lot on this to review in terms of panel design studies, which are sort of like the holy grail of work on suicide from a sociological perspective. First, the first hypothesis, states with more egalitarian policies and structures should been able, we would expect them to like hold back the rising tide in suicide in the United States. Increases in the minimum wage, another way of helping people at the bottom, should lower suicide. Increases in SNAP for food stamps should be associated with lower suicides. Something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Tax credits can help people at the bottom. Welfare payments, union density, and a couple of other hypotheses that I may not have time to get into. But basically, the thrust of what I'm talking about here is that the dominant party in control of state government, and it's like 50 state governments. Some of them are controlled by the Democrats, some of them are controlled by Republicans, but the ones that are controlled by Democrats, we would expect, would be more likely to pass minimum wage laws, food stamps, tax credits, and welfare. And to that extent that they do, well, then the suicide rate should be not increasing as fast, or it should be lower. Okay. There's not a whole lot of work on this. I've only been able to locate 9 studies. I've actually found a couple more just this week, but I didn't have time to integrate them in here, but they support what the other ones found. Okay, so there's 9 studies, and we'll look at them one by one. The first thing, though, the macro factor is the dominant political party in the state. Basically, in the United States, the Democratic Party is sort of like the left party, and the argument is, and we've been finding that democratically controlled states within the United States are more likely to increase the minimum wage and so on, and have stronger union strength. Whereas Republican-dominated state legislatures, we would expect there to be larger increases in suicide over the last 20 years. And basically what we found is this. This is the chart of suicide rates over the last 20 years. And as we noted before, the suicide rates in the United States are going up, 45%. But you can see that there's differences in the degree of increase by who controls the state government. So this is a very political orientation. The states that increased suicide the most were the Republican-controlled states. You can see in every single year, the suicide rate for Republican states is higher than the Democratic-controlled states. The purple lines are where you have mixed government. In purple, the Republicans may control, say, the Senate, and the Democrats may control the House, so that you have variation in who controls. But it's really remarkable, in every single year, those states that were controlled by the Republicans have higher suicide rates than those states that are controlled by Democrats, which are in blue. This is actually my favorite slide of all the slides we have. And it actually took a huge amount of work. Jim Gunlock, a colleague of mine, is the one that put all of this together. And it took a lot of time. But the results are really startling. Okay, minimum wage legislation. Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in economics and who wrote the book on Deaths of Despair, thought that minimum wage laws were probably the most politically feasible way of uplifting people at the bottom. There's considerable variation in the 50 states. 19 states still have a minimum wage of $7.25, which is like really not very much. The median is 10. And at the high end, at the time I put this together a couple of years ago, where you had Massachusetts and California and Washington, D.C. with minimum wages higher. So do minimum wage laws affect suicide rates? The 3 studies have analyzed this. The adjusting for relevant socioeconomic confounders, because minimum wage is kind of related to a lot of other things. For every dollar inflation-adjusted increase in the minimum wage, there was an associated 1.9% drop in suicide. And in a follow-up study by Kaufman, restricting the analysis to adults with a high school education or less, and that group is at especially high risk of suicide. The people that are left behind, they don't have, any college. They can't be computer programmers and so on, or work for Google. A $1 inflation-adjusted increase in the minimum wage was associated with a larger reduction of 5.9%, much higher than 1.9% in suicide, studied by Kaufman. And so there's been some research on that, and it tends to find the minimum wage, a macro level factor, tends to hold back the increase in suicide in the American states over like the last 20 years. And there's a lot of debates on this, and there's organizations like One Fair Wage and Fight for 15 that have been pushing for higher minimum wages with mixed success. SNAP payments, these are something that can promote economic security for people towards the bottom. They're actually called now the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program. It's a very large program. It was funded for $55 billion and reached 35 million recipients in 2019. This is one of the major programs. But individual states can be generous or kind of stingy in terms of lowering federal requirements. If you lower the federal requirements, increase the limit, you can get more people. You can be more generous to the people in your state and give them more food stamps to buy food. So that, and this is just an example in California, as the number of people in a household increases, the amount of money you can get in food stamps also increases. So this is one of the major ways that in the United States of helping the poor. The analysis by Austin looked at the 50 states over time, and you can eliminate the asset test. Like if you have too much money, say, invested in your land or your house, you eliminate or reduce that, then more people are eligible. And these changes were associated with an 8% reduction in major depression episodes, 9% reduction in mental illness, and there's more food stamp money going out, 11% reduction in suicide ideation. However, they didn't quite reduce the suicide rate. It fell short of significance, but it did improve mental health in this one analysis. Rambati, though, used a longer time span, 20 years, and found that food stamp generosity did reduce the suicide rate, and one standard deviation increase in the SNAP money could have lowered the number of suicides by 31,000 over that 20-year period. I mean, that's a lot of suicides could have been prevented. And Oda Bassi in a recent study found the same thing. The more generous states are with food stamp money, the lower the suicide rate. Okay, EITC, this is Earned Income Tax Credit. This is another way of promoting economic security at the bottom of society and preventing some of those people from killing themselves. Okay, so basically you can receive a federal tax credit. You can get money back on your income taxes at the end of the year if your income is low enough. In 2019, funds for this program were $60 billion. So this is another major way of trying to help the poor. A 10% increase in EITC was associated with a 3% decrease in the suicide rate among low educated persons. So if you look at the suicide rate among low educated persons, which is really what you should be doing, because they're the ones that have high suicide rates. And these programs that tend to disproportionately help them because they're relatively poor, seem to work. Then there's the welfare direct cash transfers to the poor, the welfare money, the temporary assistance to needy families, used to be called AFDC. The money that's been going into this direct, cash transfers to the poor has been going down, down, down. It's only 20 billion compared to like 60 billion for some of those other programs. There's, however, like substantial variation in state support. Like states can manipulate how many people are eligible for this, and they can kick in extra money if they want. And as we noted before, the percentage of poor people that actually end up getting this money, welfare, varies substantially by state. And there's this huge variation. The pioneering study was done by Flavin and Radcliffe, and they found that an increase of $45 per capita may not sound like much, but an increase of $45 per capita on welfare spending was associated with 3,000 fewer suicides over the whole period, or 272 per year. But as you can see here, the federal government in the United States has pulled way back on this program. And the number of families per 100 families that got this money was around 68 in around 1996, but it's down to 21 per 100 where families get the money in 2020. So this program, which does lower suicide rates, has been scaled way back. And food stamps and the earned income tax credit seem to be the more preferred programs, for better or worse. And then unions and economic security. Again, unions can push for higher minimum wages and more welfare payments for the poor. And although unions are only less than 10% of the workers, they only represent 10% of the workers in the U.S., they can have an impact nonetheless. Union strength is decreased from 20% to 10% from 83 to 2020. But again, they can help the people at the bottom. Unions can also be discouraged. Like in Republican states, union strength tends to be lower. The Republicans tend to be for this right to work laws, which are prevalent in a lot of the states, especially Republican states, where if there is a union in right to work, you don't have to pay union dues. You can benefit from the union, but you can opt out of paying dues. And so that really weakens the strength of the union. They can lose a lot of money under right to work governments, which are much more common in Republican states. The only systematic study I was able to find, a panel design study, was done by Eisenberg on these issues. And he found that an increase in the percentage of employees covered by union contracts was associated with a 17% decline in state suicide rates. I mean, that's like a really strong association, which suicidologists have sort of ignored or haven't bothered with it for one reason or another. States with higher union strength were found by Eisenberg to be much more likely to pass minimum wage laws and to increase welfare payments, and had, in consequence, we think, lower suicide rates. And so union strength seems to be really important, even in the United States, where only 10% of the population of the labor force belong to unions. In Europe, this percentage is much higher, and we think that's one of the reasons why suicide rates have been going down in Europe compared to the United States. Okay, I have inequalities in occupational injury. This is something that there's no panel studies on this yet, but I think it's worth mentioning. It's another relatively unstudied area in suicide studies, as far as I know. The idea, I published a recent article in Archives of Suicide Research, and my argument is that in occupations, and a lot of these occupations are in the lower, echelons of society, working class occupations mainly. Roofers in particular, they're an illustration of something larger. They have a fatal injury rate of 48 per 100,000, the fourth highest in the United States, behind loggers and workers in fisheries. But the idea is that for people at the bottom that are working in dangerous occupations like roofing, like a lot of roofers fall off the roof, they break arms, legs, dislocate their backs, and have pain. These sorts of dangerous occupations can have and do have higher suicide rates. Roofers have a seventh highest suicide rate of 65 per 100,000 roofers. And then we have an example of a roofer. This guy here has a harness, but I stop at roofer sites in my neighborhood all the time, and I've never seen anybody that has a harness, to protect them if they fall. They tend not to use them. But, you can see it's easy to get off balance. If the wind starts, you can, get off balance and fall, wrench your neck or back. And these are the fatal injury rates. Loggers and fishers are higher than roofers. Yeah, in all occupations, only three per 100,000 workers actually die. But roofers, it's 48 per 100,000 die on the job from injuries. So in my preliminary work, this needs to be replicated for other occupations. But if the injury rate is high, people have broken arms and bones, burns, there's pain. And a lot of these guys are on opioids. And a lot of those get, addicted to opioids. And opioids, of course, are a risk factor for suicide. So injury, pain, painkillers for opioids, and they increase the risk of suicide. So I have a new theory of occupational injury and suicide, something that's relatively unexplored in suicide studies. But a lot of these people work down at the bottom of society. Okay, and then debt. Debt is another, there's no panel studies on this yet. They could be done, but no one's done anything yet. But there is work that shows that persons in debt have higher suicide rates. There was a meta-analysis of 52 papers on unsecured, in other words, like credit card debt, not mortgage debt, but unsecured debt. And for studies predicting suicide deaths, persons with significant debt were 7.9 times more likely to die by suicide than persons without debt. So like there's some work that shows that like debt is like something that's really aggravating and can gnaw away at you. You may have to sell your car, your house, and you can face bankruptcy. And there's a lot of bankruptcies every year. In Europe, in Sweden, they followed 57,000 people for 2 years, and persons who had significant debt at follow-up were 2 times more likely to attempt suicide than others without such debt. In the United States, there's a relatively unexplored area in suicide. Debt exemption laws, like when you declare bankruptcy, there's like legal proceedings, and in some states they exempt you, say for maybe 20% of your debt is just forgiven. In other states, no, they don't forgive you for any of your debt. And so that somebody could do a study that looks at the degree of debt exemption laws in each of the 50 states and see whether or not it predicts suicide. Okay, so in conclusions, although suicide rates have been increasing in the United States up for 20 years now, state programs to improve economic security have actually held back, have pulled back or put the brakes on some of that so that the rates haven't increased quite as much in the Democratic controlled states, for example. The concluding remark gets back to the title of the talk. What is the efficacy of macro income enhancing interventions? Like we've showed that most of the time in the 9 studies that we have, food stamps and minimum wage laws and these sorts of things tend to work. For the micro-oriented average intervention effects, you can look at a study by Fox. Fox looked at 591 of the best studies. These are randomized controlled trials, or RCT studies, and looked at the effect sizes of the psychological interventions for preventing suicide. And the average intervention effect for suicide ideation was significant. That RCTs designed to try to reduce thinking about suicide reduced the risk 9%. So that's important. These things do work, and some of them work better than others. For suicide attempts, though, the relative risk was 0.98 with a confidence interval that included 1, so that they were not significant. The interventions to reduce suicide attempts on the whole didn't work. However, some of those randomized controlled trials in the second group, reducing suicide attempts, did work. And so you really have to be very careful if you're interested in those sorts of interventions to pick the ones that actually work, because on the whole, if you lump them all together, you don't have anything. So you have to really be careful to pick ones that are evidence-based. And then for suicide deaths, the RCTs as a whole had no impact on reducing suicide deaths. But in contrast, macro income enhancing interventions such as minimum wage, SNAP, EITC, and union density generally have been shown to reduce suicide death rates. And so that the bottom line of my talk, after going through all those, mainly 8 hypotheses, mainly the 4 in particular, the average efficacy of macro intervention seems higher. They seem to be higher because almost all the time they work than the micro interventions. The micro interventions tend not to work very well at all for preventing suicide deaths or attempts, but some of them do work. And so it's like really important to pick out the ones that do work. For the macro interventions, it's like almost all of the time you find that they work. So the efficacy or the effectiveness is very different. Limitations of what I did. I didn't include opioid overdoses. A lot of the deaths that are from opioid overdoses are labeled, drug deaths, but some of them are actually suicides. Ian Rocket estimates around 20% of opioid overdose deaths are really suicides, but they get misclassified because the coroners don't have the resources to do psychological autopsies on a lot of these cases. And so that they're like a gamble with death. I think that these analyses really need to be redone, adding on, say, 20% of the opioid overdoses. Maybe I'll get to that myself. And so that's all I have. And now I have some time for questions.
Thank you, Stephen, for your presentation. And we indeed have some questions. Let's start from one sort of clarifying question. So, in your opinion, which of the economic and welfare policies you presented today are the most relevant to preventing suicide?
I think I'd agree with the Nobel Prize winner, Angston Deaton, the minimum wage. There's a lot of efforts being made, and there's like organizations like a fair wage and so on, and minimum wage laws are being debated, and in some states, like in California and Oregon, they are being implemented. However, with the election of Donald Trump, I think that there may be backlash against increasing the minimum wage faster than inflation. But I think that's something that a lot of people do support. But it'll work probably in the states that are controlled by the Democrats, and they probably won't work very well in the Republican states, because that's what we've been finding in the past.
So you mentioned Donald Trump. So then I go to the question which also mentions Donald Trump. Could you explain why so many people vote for Trump's leadership, even though, as you've shown, Republican policies are known to increase income inequality by cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations?
That's a really important question. I don't know whether I am like fully qualified to answer that, but I think that the working class in the United States has been tricked by Trump. He kind of reminds me of Adolf Hitler in a way, because Hitler was against the Jews, and Trump is pulling, is against the immigrants. He wants to round up all the immigrants and get them out of the country, just like Hitler rounded up the Jews and put them into concentration camps. And that kind of authoritarian, like dramatic mindset, I think, appeals to a good part of the working class. The working class, there are books written on working class authoritarianism. The people at the bottom are much more likely to be authoritarian, and much more likely to be angry, externalize their aggression. And so that I think that's where a lot of this comes from. The people at the bottom feel left behind. The rural people in impoverished areas in Appalachia, they feel left behind, and they're angry, and they kind of like this guy, that's out to get the immigrants, and blames the immigrants for rising crime, which is really kind of a facade. But it's sort of an emotional thing, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Different sort of question. You describe what government can do to reduce the likelihood of suicide by changing the level of income inequality. What about psychologists, social workers? What can we do to reduce the risk in this case?
Well, I think that what you're doing is great. Various psychological interventions do work. I think you have to, pick and choose. The funding, though, for psychological interventions in the United States could be vastly improved. I have friends that are therapists, but I'm not qualified to do therapy myself. But I have friends, and they point out that in concrete practice, you get more money uh, out of middle class people versus people that are poor. That they may get Medicaid, but the rate of you might get like $200 an hour if from a regular Blue Cross fully insured person, and you may get half of that for the people on Medicaid. So in a lot of the clinics, there's waiting lists of people on Medicaid. They're not really that enthusiastic about helping the poor that have mentally troubled minds because they don't get paid as much. Medicaid doesn't pay you as much as private insurance. So I think that pushing for better mental health coverage, at least in the context of the United States, I think is really important.
Yeah. So actually, there is a question precisely to this concerning this aspect. Do you know of any studies comparing access to medical services between the comparison of access to medical services between the US and EU?
Um, I imagine there are studies, but that's like a gap in my knowledge. I really would like to know more about that. I would anticipate that access is better in the European countries and in the United States. Um, in the National Violent Death Reporting System that I've used, I have data on 30,000 people that died by suicide, and only around 4% of them had seen in the year of their suicide, only about 4% of them had seen a mental health professional at least once. Now, and a lot of them, they may have just seen them once or twice. I mean, what good is that going to do? So that the access seems to be very low to me from what I know, but I don't have any data from Europe. But I would imagine, given that funding is higher in Europe, I think you probably do see more of the at-risk population there.
Okay. And there is one question about specifically about debt. So debt is an additional burden to a person who already feels like a burden, isn't it?
Yeah, burdensomeness. Yeah, the Durkheim dealt with that. It was kind of not really discussed by Thomas Joyner. Thomas Joyner is the one that I think has elevated burdensomeness in his interpersonal theory of suicide. Um, I um, I think uh, that burdensomeness, I think, is much more common in the elderly population, where people are, physically incapacitated and disabled, um, and disability is higher in the lower socioeconomic classes. Um, I'm not really sure uh, what to do about burdensomeness. I don't really know a whole lot about it, but I think it's real. Um, uh, in my own experience with suicidal people, again, I'm not a therapist, so they are kind of difficult to live around. They're gloomy. Uh, you know, they're not happy people, and so if you have to live with them, that's a real problem for caregivers. It's not just the individual. It feels like a burden, but you know, burdensomeness, I think, is really real. I'm not really sure exactly what to do about it.
Yeah. It seems that people enjoyed very much the slide that you enjoyed yourself with the comparison between states that are governed by Democrats and
Mm.
Republicans. And some of them, some of the listeners suggest that we do the same comparison in Lithuania, but some of them also, I think, quite right in saying that, in asking whether these kind of comparisons at all are possible in such a small country with 3 million population and actually with no different states. It's just a government
Mm.
and then local municipalities which do not have too much of power in choosing the social welfare or income interventions.
Mm.
Do you
Yeah, I
have any
think
thoughts on that?
yeah, I think like my review of the panel studies, the 9 big panel studies, we have 50 states. And that could be replicated in some other countries, like in Japan. I think they have about 50 prefectures, and in Germany there are regions, so that you could, in some countries where you have a lot of decentralized units, individual states or provinces. In Canada, I think there's like 10 provinces. So you could replicate it, I think, in some countries, but in your country, it sounds like everything's centralized. So you could maybe look at it over time, like maybe over like 40 years, and who controls uh, the central government over 40 years. I'm not really familiar with Lithuania, but
It
over
seems
time, you
it
could maybe
seems
look
that
at it.
more general factors, more social factors are in place because, for example, during the last how many 12 years there was a steady decrease of suicide in Lithuania. Doesn't
Mm.
matter who is in government, which party is in government, the suicide is decreasing. So you cannot much to tell much about this because it's for 12 years we have 3 different governments, but the overall trend is decreasing.
Yeah, yeah, that's another issue that I haven't really dealt with. In the European countries, some of the countries in Eastern Europe and Western Europe have experienced far larger drops in suicide, and that I think is worth a study in itself. Like why within Europe, why do some countries have in Lithuania, if I remember right, you used to have the world's highest or one of the world's highest
Yeah,
suicide
yeah,
rates, and it's gone way down. I mean, that's something
that's
I'd like to
incredible.
know more about.
Yeah, actually, the decrease is more than 2 times,
Mm.
starting from the year 2000 until now. It's a 2 times decrease. It's just really, really big one. So
Yeah, that's great. That's remarkable.
yeah, people write that they loved your presentation, and I want to ask the last question. It's not entirely connected to the topic of your presentation, but I think it connects very well to the other research that you are doing. So the question is this: do you think suicide and its consequences, depiction in fiction books, could help raise awareness of the topic and importance of mental health?
Um, yeah, in fact, I have a paper under review right now on 62 feature films, like the really big hits in the United States from 1950 to 2002, which I have data on. And the stories, the narratives where a person is suicidal, attempts suicide in the beginning, but then through various changes that they go through, they end up happy at the end. And there's like 62 movies like that. And if you look at the number of, happy, we call them Papageno stories, stories
Yeah.
where the individual gets better. A suicidal individual gets better by the end through therapy, but mostly through love affairs. Um, the suicide rate is lower in those years. There's anywhere from 0 to 6 stories of recovery per year. And the years where you have like more of the Papageno movies, there's actually lower suicide. So
Wow.
I think there is something there.
Wow. That's very interesting. So you can spend money on minimal wage, or you can maybe hire a Hollywood company to make a new movie with Papageno effect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Stephen, so much for your wonderful presentation. I think that's very much important for us, to have understanding of biological interventions, then, psychological interventions, and then, about sociology. Everything is limited and not enough. So it's good to have you on board and have this perspective from sociological point of view. So really, thank you very much for this
Well,
presentation.
thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.